Thank you, Denise, and very happy to be here this morning. This morning we're going to talk about, well, first let me introduce myself. I'm Tom Lee with Simpler, Audun Utengen, also with Simpler, and we're going to talk about two short stories this morning. The first one is going to be relevant to everybody in this room because we're going to talk about how with the right focus, the right technology, one can do some amazing things in the healthcare industry. And we're going to use this conference from last year as a case study for that. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to tell a short story about the variety and really immense conversations that are happening around pharmaceuticals and social media. And we're going to see what type of interesting things we can find when we combine the social data with external databases, public databases that are being made available. Not all conferences are created equal. And, you know, some, they capture our imagination. We walk away with a feeling of empowerment, both personally and professionally. Others, they're fine, but they don't necessarily leave a lasting impression. And months later, when we think about these impactful moments at the really great conferences, we remember quite a bit about it, and not so much necessarily about the less eventful ones. And so when we look at Doctors 2.0 last year, we take a look at what were those top topics of conversation. And it's so obvious that when we see that the patients rose to the top in a lot of these discussions, it was evident that there were going to be stories told that would really start to create some waves around the world. And when we look at Doctors 2.0, this is really, as Denise pointed out, this is one of the most patient-inclusive conferences in Europe. And this chart here is looking at last year, comparing Doctors 2.0 to other significant conferences in Europe, just from the standpoint of the proportion of tweets coming out that had to do with having the word patient or patients in those tweets. And not to be so surprising, the second most common topic of conversation was centered around the doctor, the physician. We also look at a timeline over the 2 days of the conference, and we can see where the spikes in activity were that caught everybody's imagination. And in day one last year, you'll note that Michael Saras was moderating a panel on patient-designed healthcare, and that really was the top buzz of day one. And on day two, that's right. On day two, it was Carrie Sparling when she was talking about her life as a type 1 diabetic and issues that she was having with insulin. That really kind of captured everybody's imagination. It was the most discussed topic that day on social media having to do with this conference. So how do we know if a conference has had a lasting impact? And at Simpler, you know, we look at data all the time, social data, and we believe that one way we can tell is that when we look at the after-conference conversation on social media, how active is it? And what we usually find, and we track over 2,000 healthcare conferences from around the world, what we find is that soon after the conference is over with, immediately after, the social conversation just flatlines, like you can see in the blue graph up on the top. Those that really struck a chord and that have a lasting impression on people are those where the conversation about the conference is continuing long afterwards. And Doctors 2.0 has been a prime example of that, as you can see by last year's graph on the bottom there for this conference. And it's not just the tweets. We look at the blog posts that are written about the conference after the conference. And how those are shared across various social media channels. And really what it all comes down to is stories at these conferences. Stories are powerful. They capture our attention. We share them. Sometimes they go viral. And it should be no surprise that when you include patients in a conference, that you're going to get more stories. Stories that engage us, compel us to share them, and when we share them on social media, those that are close to us, we're sharing them with our followers on Twitter, we're sharing them with our friends on Facebook, and really, There are no stories that are more important that we need to hear than those that are from the patients. Thank you very much, and I'm going to turn this over to Audun for our second story.
Thank you, Tom. So our short second story is basically constructed to aid the discussion later on between Dr. Mark Davis and Michael Saris. And it starts with a pharmaceutical drug conversation on Twitter. And thanks to Denise Silber, we've been able to do some research on this very subject recently. At Simpler, we have one of the larger databases of healthcare social media conversations. And it turns out that in this database exists about 42.9 million tweets mentioning various drug names. Here are just some of these drug names. And we're going to briefly take a look at these 3 cancer drugs. And by comparing the last 2 years, we can look at the annual growth rate of these tweets. And from these 3 drugs, it's 109%. Here's the tweet activity broken down by the drug name over the same 24-month period. Seeing the incredible growth and some interesting spikes taking place. So where are these conversations originating? Here's a map that answers that. By the way, those of you who attended our demo session yesterday will recognize this chart. It's one of the many real-time charts rendered with our signals tool that we demoed for the first time publicly yesterday here at Doctors 2.0. Let's zoom in on the US data. You know, social data is great, but the real magic really happens when you combine it with public health data. And last year's conference, we showed you how we track some US doctors. And since then, we were able to filter out their tweets from a tweet stream. And in this case, they're talking about the Gleevec drug. Since last year, there's a new data set that's been released by the US government. So we're able to merge these into our database and give you more information about these doctors. Here's the same social data, but it's merged with the data showing how much these doctors have been paid by the US government for their services. So you're often seen as doing top influencer lists based on social data, like tweets, mentions, impressions. But by merging these data sets together, we can get other ways to look at other ways to visualize this data. And here's one way to look at it. Also, last year, we showed you an individual doctor's network centrality graph, which basically shows who a doctor influences in the online world. And since then, another data set released by the US government shows us who a doctor refers patients to. And with that referral data, we can finally visualize who a doctor influences in the offline world as well. So, tremendous opportunities opens up when you bridge these data sets, online data with the offline data. Thank you so much for your time.